water. My water bill is about 3 or 4 times the average person. I wash my hands about 50 times a day. I know they're dirty.
What are you afraid of getting?
I worry about AIDS. Just different diseases, germs, things that might hurt my son, things that might hurt myself, viruses, different things are shed from the body.
Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. A few weeks ago, San Jose played host to the Obsessive Compulsive Foundation's annual membership conference. Psychiatrists once thought compulsive disorders were rare conditions. However, more current surveys suggest that it's 1% to 2% of the population, which would mean as many as 15,000 people just in San Jose. Tonight, we learn the difference between common quirks, such as organizing the refrigerator shelves in a particular pattern, and compulsions that can preoccupy a person, causing them to lose jobs or alienate people they love. The preoccupations and compulsive behavior come unbidden and are unwanted, and unfortunately are often unrecognized and go untreated. We are fortunate to have returning guest to Bay Area Psychology, Dr. Bernard Schoberg of the Phobia Counseling Center in San Jose. I want to thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Our opening clip was taken from an episode of 48 Hours on anxiety, fears, and phobias. And I'm wondering if the sort of the hand-washing example is sort of the classic Lady Macbeth example, but...
Well, that is the classic example. In fact, one of the first major books on obsessive compulsive disorder, which I think was written about 1989, very recently, by Judith Rappaport, was entitled The Boy Who Couldn't Stop Washing.
That's right.
So we know that this is a fairly common symptom pattern. I want to draw a distinction, by the way, between people who are sometimes called compulsive because they're very perfectionistic, they're very ambitious, they're very particular about the way they handle their work or their life. That's a much larger group of people than true OCD victims. People who are just perfectionistic or very particular in what they do usually have good self-esteem. They have good work records, they have good family relationships and so forth. That is not what we mean by OCD. OCD is a much more invasive condition where the person ends up frequently spending many, many hours a day in pointless rituals, in thoughts that he can't get out of his mind.
Okay.
And therefore, it actually begins to deteriorate the quality of a person's life over time.
This seems like a good point to actually look at the definition, the formal definition of obsessive compulsive disorder. An obsession is a persistent preoccupation with something, typically an idea or feeling. A compulsion is an impulsive or behavior experienced as irresistible. Compulsions are often carried out to relieve the anxiety caused by the unwanted thoughts or feelings. So this lends itself to what you were saying before, which is this is something that sounds very painful for someone.
It is very painful. About 80% of sufferers of OCD have both the obsessive and the compulsive components. 20% have only one or the other. So the two frequently do go together. Okay. And the way they go together is that the compulsion or a ritual that the person feels driven to perform leads to a temporary relief of anxiety. In other words, the obsessive thought comes to mind, the unwanted thought, the brooding thought that they can't get out of their mind. So they're driven to do the ritual, which in turn temporarily relieves the anxiety. That's why it becomes so powerful over time, because the relief of anxiety is such a powerful reinforcer.
Yeah.
But it's only temporary. It begins to come back, and so the person then is driven to go through the same pattern again in order to get that temporary relief.
Well, in the clip I took the opening segment from, she talked about how what would happen for her was she would begin to wonder if perhaps her child was getting ill, and that she would often call the doctor 10 and 11 times a day. She showed a hotline list where she could call when she was feeling anxious, because it would just sort of pop up in her head.
Yeah. Fear of contamination is another big area of obsessive thought that a person can get into. It might be a fear of being contaminated personally, or contaminating like a family member, like making someone sick through preparing a dinner that might have botulism in it.
Yeah.
So there's an example, for example, of a lady who went through 20 cans of stewed tomatoes. Each time she'd open a can, put it in the pot, and then the thought would enter her mind, perhaps this is a contaminated can, it's got botulism. She'd throw it down the disposal, open another can until she had 20 cans lined up on her kitchen sink. Now, intellectually, she knew that this was senseless, that it wasn't a true reflection of reality. But the characteristic of the condition is the person is nevertheless driven to perform these rituals over and over again.
Well, I would gather that that is what would cause the pain, which is if I know that what I'm doing doesn't make any sense, and I'm doing it anyway. I mean, that awareness, I would imagine, would be very distressing.
Exactly, plus the wasted time and energy and the loss of zest for living. Because if you're compelled, say, 6 or 8 hours a day to perform these useless rituals or checking behavior, we haven't touched on that.
Yeah.
It could be someone who can't leave the house unless they go through an elaborate procedure with locking the door, going back numerous times before they get it just right, before something clicks in the mind that allows them to leave. But this could take an hour or more. For example, I worked with a janitor one time in an office building who he was taking 14 hours to do an 8-hour shift because each office door that he would close, he could not convince himself that he'd actually locked it. And he would have to put pressure on the doorknob for up to like 6 or 8, 10 minutes before he could convince himself that the door was actually locked. And then he could go on to the next office. So this is an example of how not only the irrationality of it affects people, but the time drain, the fact that you have no time left for anything else in your life, virtually, if it really gets a hold of you.
Well, and you know, I'm wondering, I know I had a client once that used to arrange shoes in a certain pattern because she couldn't sleep otherwise. And she identified for her almost a magical quality to it. That if they're lined up like this, I'll be okay. And if they're not, I won't.
That's right. It's a lot of it has to do with protecting the person from feeling that a disaster could happen if they don't do the ritual correctly or the checking correctly. One problem that can be a real devastating situation for many people is driving when they have OCD, because one of the favorite kinds of obsessions that develops when people who have this condition drive is that they may have hit someone while they were driving. So I've had people who actually had to go back and check 3, 4, 5, 6 times, go around the block, turn around, go back and check and see if there's a body lying on the side of the roadway that they may have hit. So every little pothole in the road becomes a major threat. Did I hit a child who was crossing and I didn't see him? So this kind of behavior can lead to requiring 3 hours to get to work in the morning because you have to go back and
keep
check.
doing that. Where does this come from? I mean, what causes OCD?
Well, there's a combination of factors. We know today that there is a strong genetic component. About 15 to 20% of all the people who suffer from this have immediate family members who suffer from it as well. And it may not be the same symptom pattern. So it's not something that they picked up because they learned it from watching a parent in action or whatever. So it may have a totally different focus, but it's still considered OCD, which is one of the major anxiety disorders. There are 13 major anxiety disorders, and that is one of them. And it's actually more prevalent today, we've discovered, than schizophrenia. It's more prevalent than panic disorder. But it's been hidden because so many people have kept it in the closet because they have worried about themselves going crazy. That seems so crazy to them. They don't want to admit it, and so they attempt to hide it.
Well, and part of, what I've learned in my research, and I've certainly seen with clients, is the secretiveness about this.
Yes.
You know, that it's not something you talk about freely at the office, and it must have to do with that awareness factor, which is, I know that if I told somebody it takes me 3 hours to get to work, they'd know they think I was nuts, you know, because I think I'm nuts. So I can understand why you wouldn't have been able to have discovered this sooner. We're going to need to take a quick break. Stay tuned. When we return, we'll learn how to intervene and treat this disorder.
Collecting papers, mostly papers, books. The books, I guess, are acceptable socially, you know. There's no problems, no stigma. This is papers that people throw them out after a day or so. I didn't. This is an old one, come to think of it. It's 84, 6 years old. I read it, obviously, at the time I bought it, about it, but I evidently wanted to, you know, look at it again. One time I was collecting countless papers, different periodicals. I'm lucky that New York doesn't have too many newspapers anymore.
Welcome back. We were discussing causation when we left, what causes OCD, and as we came back, we had another clip of a man, in this particular case, doing hoarding behavior with paper. And in this particular segment, he was showing many storage lockers. And at one point takes the reporter into his home, which he's barely able to get into because there's so many papers and things that he can't even sleep there anymore.
That's another form of it that the symptom pattern can take. The person fears that if they throw anything away, something terrible will happen. And so they must accumulate more and more. Some of the people who go to garage sales, I'm sure, are collecting items to make themselves feel more comfortable when they, you know, can take that into their home. And it's like the home full of junk becomes a armory against the outside world, the anxiety that might be there that they somehow are protecting against.
And do they know what exactly it is they're afraid of?
Well, people can discuss in great detail what their obsessions and compulsions are, but they seldom can understand why they're having them. So that the why is indecipherable to most of them. They just don't have a rationale, and that's why they feel they're going crazy often.
Okay, which leads us back to the why question I asked you, which is you had mentioned the role of genetics. What other thing might play here?
The genetics part, of course,